And my microphone is not working, so I'll speak loudly and introduce Bill Overholt, who will speak on U.S.-China relations, myths, and reality.
I've titled this talk Myths and Reality because our public discourse has been so polluted by a series of myths, interest group generated myths for the most part, that you have to get through the nonsense before you can talk about reality. And on this slide, I've listed a series of the myths. I'm not going to be able to cover all of these, but I just want to give you a flavor, and many of the details are in the paper that I posted on the web. Everyone has read probably several dozen times about the loss of 3 million manufacturing jobs we've had to China. Any economist can do the algebra and show that almost all the decline of manufacturing jobs in this country has been due to productivity increasing faster than the general economy. Microcosm. In the automobile industry, it used to take 40 hours to make a car, 40 hours of labor. It now takes 15. Now, unless the total number of cars being sold grows faster than that decline, you need fewer workers. That's why U.S. manufacturing jobs have declined. Almost none of the decline has to do with China. Similarly, we were told because the Chinese have cheap labor, almost all manufacturing is migrating to China. Well, U.S. manufacturing is growing very nicely. The production, the output is growing. Imports from China constitute about 3% of our domestic manufacturing, which is growing quite quickly. Well, in the future, they're going to take it all over because they're graduating 10 times as many engineers as we are. Again, anybody who reads the newspapers has seen this. It happens that 90% of the engineering graduates, the China graduates, we're talking apples and oranges here. These are, they're counting associate degrees versus good bachelor's degrees. 90% of those who are counted in the 10 times as many would not qualify for even the most basic job in any multinational corporation. So the reality is China's got the same number of engineers we do for 4 times the population in a period of development where manufacturing and therefore engineers are the most dynamic sector, and there's an unusual need for engineers. Well, similarly, there's a whole set of myths about the currency. The biggest one is that somehow if they would increase the value of their currency, our trade deficit would decline. When we spend so much more than we save, we have to borrow from someplace. We have not been saving because we've been refinancing the increase in the value of our houses. World Bank studies show that almost all of the trade deficit has to do with the extraordinary U.S. demand generated by the housing boom and the refinancing. We think we're saving because our bank accounts keep getting fatter because of the housing increase. The currency has very little to do with it. By raising the Chinese currency, we can shift our deficit to Vietnam and Malaysia, some other places, but we can't reduce the total deficit. Now, the end of the housing boom is going to start to solve this problem, but it will take a long time. My favorite one, because I was paid to come back to this country after living in Hong Kong for 16 years because of this, is the myth that if China's successful with all this trade and foreign direct investment it's getting, must be sucking the life out of the neighbors, right? Well, let me show you what's happening to the neighbors. These are exports to China. Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines. The takeoff of these exports to China began in a big scale just when the tech bust happened. And this saved the smaller countries of Asia from catastrophe in the tech bust. Not only would the Philippines have gone bust without the explosion of exports to China, we would probably have a different regime in the Philippines today. It would have been so severe. Similarly with investment. China is getting all this investment. India, Japan, and Korea must be getting less. No, there was lots of investment in the world, but these countries were keeping it out. And once they had to compete with China, they had to open up to our companies. So the total foreign direct investment into other countries in Asia has gone up, and not just a little bit, quite dramatically. Excuse me, I missed one here. This shows both exports and imports. The yellow line is Asia, the smaller Asian countries' trade surplus with China. Now, it's not just that their exports exploded, it's that their imports didn't explode at the same rate. So there was a tremendous surplus there that floated them through the crisis. One of the greatest myths is China is changing economically, but it's not changing politically. And the tension between these is going to destabilize China. 15 years ago, we had the economic equivalent of this. China said, we're going to change our economy incrementally, one step at a time. And our wisdom was, no, you got to do it by shock therapy all at once. Washington Consensus. You couldn't publish an article in those days in respectable journals, I know I tried, saying that China's model would be successful based on the fact that they were just doing the things that Taiwan and Singapore and Korea had done in the past. Well, it worked. Now they're saying, we're changing our politics step by step, and we're giving them the same ridicule, more than ridicule, contempt. China is not stagnant. There are no Brezhnevs and Chernenkos in China saying the system 15 years from now will be like the system today. They started with rules to eliminate arbitrary rule. It began with, we're going to fix a retirement date, and the old geezers are going to have to accept that. In 2003, it got to the point, no more great man rule. Personal freedom of speech has expanded. There are transparency exercises at every level in every region of China. I'll just tell you two stories. In 1998, I was asked to give the centennial lecture for Peking University. And one of the students stood up afterwards and he said, Dr. Overholt, we were assigned your book, The Rise of China, and we were assigned Gordon Chang's book, The Coming Collapse of China. And he said, Gordon Chang says our economics is changing and our politics isn't. What do you think? I said, well, I think the fact that you were assigned those two books in China's leading university and that you feel free standing up in front of 2,000 people and asking that question is the answer to your question. China is still a brutal dictatorship, but it is totally different from Mao's China. And everybody in the Chinese leadership understands that that evolution is going to continue and it's going to have to be rapid. A month ago, they sent out a circular saying from now on the Public Security Bureau has to treat demonstrations and NGO protests as valuable kind of venting of public frustrations. They didn't do that in the Soviet Union. I've got pages and pages of documentation of all that, but I don't have time. Let me talk about geopolitics. And there are three sort of theories that predominate. There are two that predominate in our press. One is that democracies are peaceful and non-democracies, especially countries led by a communist party, are inherently aggressive. A few months ago, one of our most distinguished admirals was asked, why do we want to be strategic partners with India and not China? And he said, our political scientists have taught us that democracies are peaceful and that non-democracies are not. And the Chinese kind of roll their eyes. We've been doing some studies at RAND, and we have this bad habit of making columns of facts. So let me just do a side-by-side. This two could go on for 12 pages, and in every column the answers are the same. But China says, we're just a poor country. We don't have any ambitions to be a great power. India says if President Bush wants to visit, he has to acknowledge that we are a great power today. China had 14 serious border problems. For instance, 1.5 million kilometers disputed with with Russia. They have solved, to the satisfaction of the other side, 12 of those, or 13 if you include Bhutan. There's some ambiguity about Bhutan. India has never compromised any border dispute. It has serious border disputes with all of its neighbors. China says no foreign bases as a matter of principle. India is seeking as many as it can get, so far one, in Central Asia. If you compare their military ambitions, India says we're going to dominate from the Red Sea to the South China Sea. China is very focused on the Taiwan issue and some neighboring territorial waters issues, which, by the way, are getting negotiated. When we say that our political science has statistics that show statistically on average democracies are more peaceful, which is not exactly what the literature says, and therefore India must be more peaceful than China, and therefore India is our appropriate ally. The Chinese reaction is like when peasants were waving the little red book to make the rice grow faster. We have a serious ideological problem. We do have some very real issues. As long as you have brutal treatment of religious groups, with China, this country in China is going to have a problem. We have numerous economic issues, all of which are resolvable when you start looking at them without the myths I talked about. They're serious, you have to negotiate, you have to posture, you have to yell a lot, but none of these is any bigger, for instance. Numbers are bigger, but the proportions aren't than what we had with Japan 20 years ago. And a lot of the posturing in the interest group stuff is the same. But I've highlighted intellectual property rights because that's having a decisive influence on the balance. The other big one is managing tensions across the Taiwan Straits. And this is going on two tracks. One is that politically it's becoming much easier. President Bush and President Hu Jintao have a better understanding about this issue than any two Chinese and American presidents have ever had. And the force of the independence movement in Taiwan, which is based in a very small minority of the population, about 14% want early independence, about 5% want early unification. Everybody else is in the middle, sort of like want the status quo. Chen Shui-bian has basically self-destructed. He's a competitor for the most unpopular president of any country on earth today. And the Chinese have learned better not to throw missiles and better to offer all sorts of economic incentives, invite all the leaders other than Chen Shui-bian, including members of his party, to come to Beijing and have a chat. That part's becoming easier. Militarily, though, we got a problem. As China develops, it gets more military power. Their guys have been told, in case Taiwan breaks away to become independent, you've got to deal with it. Our guys have been told, if there's a problem, if there's a conflict, you've got to be ready to solve it. Well, it's 90 miles from China, and it's a lot farther than that from here, so it's a big problem. It's a big problem for them because we're pretty strong, and it's a big problem for us because it's far away. As they get stronger, we have to get closer and closer to Taiwan. We have to have the trigger finger tighter and tighter. And this becomes more and more dangerous, and it can't go on this way for more than a few years. Now, the Chinese proposed arms control, and we blew them off. That you don't read about very much in the press. But that's a very, very serious problem. And guys on both sides get paranoid, and they write paranoid things, and then they quote each other's paranoid things. So we really need to worry about this. I'm going to finish with two issues. One issue is that all this noise, all the economic myths are becoming much more politically powerful in a context which makes it much more dangerous. Our whole post-World War II prosperity is built on a gradual process of globalization. That process is now in trouble. Why? In Europe, you see the French and the Dutch voting against the Polish plumber, against the European Constitution. That's a vote against globalization. That hasn't happened before. The Doha trade round is stalled. Hasn't happened that way before. In this country, there have been two balance shifts. The Congress is always protectionist, and the president is always some variety of free trader. Doesn't matter Republican or Democrat, those two things are always true. When you have a very weak president, the Congress starts getting in the driver's seat, and that's what's happening now because of the Iraq war. It doesn't have anything to do with China, but you see the escalation of anti-China rhetoric, which these interest groups pushing their points with much more power before. The other thing is that you've always had a political balance between the leading edge of the economic wing and the trailing edge. The little furniture companies, the shoe companies, the people who make socks are always there in Congress saying, this is terrible, Japan's terrible, South Korea is terrible, Taiwan's terrible, now it's China that's terrible. Same stuff. They've always been balanced by the big companies, General Motors, Caterpillar, Motorola, which are fabulously successful because of globalization. General Motors exists today because of its huge profits in China. Otherwise, those workers would all have lost their jobs. And those mainly things, all made in China. The balance has shifted because of the intellectual property issue. Now, China's behavior in intellectual property is the same as India's, it's the same as Russia's. We did a study of this for a big company that was really angry at the Chinese. Could we shift all of our stuff to India? No. On manufacturing, China's better. On movies, India's a little better. On balance, they're the same. But China's big, so it has a huge impact. So the big companies are sitting the fight out. And these two shifts in the balance have shifted our politics. And in China, after all the stress of adaptation to WTO, I disagree with Professor Dreyer. They lost 25 million manufacturing jobs in the WTO process. They lost 50 million state enterprise jobs in the state enterprise process. It changed them so much they couldn't stand it anymore. Now the leaders talking about harmonious society. They're trying to get beyond that, trying to overcome the stress of that. Well, last slide. I just talked about the economic relationship, the big issue. The big issue in the political side is our post-Cold War hangover. Since the Cold War ended, we've got the institutions of the Cold War without a Cold War. Institutions like the US-Japan alliance. But we've got a caricatured version. We won the Cold War by rebuilding Europe with the Marshall Plan and protecting it with the military. We won in Asia by building up Japan and Indonesia and South Korea economically and protecting that process with the military. Without the economic component, Indonesia would be 10 Iraqs. Well, the economic component is withered. We had, for 50 years, a policy that balanced India and China. We protected Japan through the alliance. We protected China by keeping India disarmed. And it was very conscious that we were protecting, the core of American policy of preserving stability in Asia was not to let these guys go at each other again. Now what we've done is to put all the focus on Japan, point the gun at China. In 2005, the Japanese declared China is their principal potential enemy. We brought Taiwan under the US-Japan alliance. The whole game has changed. Asia is polarizing. So our bet is all on Japan today. Now what's happening as we manage the big Asian issues? If you look at the big political issues, war on terror, we sit down with the Chinese and we decide what to do, and we bring the Koreans and the Russians and the Japanese along. North Korea, we and the Chinese sit down and decide what needs to be done, with a lot of fussing around tactics, but the two of us decide. And we drag the Russians and the South Koreans, and not so successfully this last time, the Japanese along. Regional crime, human rights, drugs, I'm on my last point. Economics, free trade, we and the Chinese are in the lead, Japan and India dragging their feet. Freedom of investment, we and the Chinese are so far in the lead you can't even see Japan and India from there. Genetically modified crops, agriculture is at the core of world economic issues, and genetically modified crops are the biggest one. It's us, we are the #1 in technology and production and consumption. China is #2 in technology, production, and consumption, and the two of us are battling the Japanese, the Indians, and the Europeans. So we've got a funny situation here. Funny situation that the Cold Warriors can't even see, where we're betting everything militarily on Japan, and we're running Asia through a US-China bicondominium. And that is totally unstable. It won't work. It's going to break down sometime soon. This is what always happens. Militaries prepare for the last war. We're seeing some consequences of that. State departments and other people also do that. We haven't thought this through. We're either going to head to a new Cold War or a collapse of globalization or some kind of more balanced relationship with China and Japan than we have today. I would remind you that we spent, in the last century, we spent the first half of the century with Japan as the ultimate evil. Their child-rearing practices, our anthropologists told us, made them inherently authoritarian. And China was, Chiang Kai-shek was the avatar of democracy. And then in the middle of the century, we flipped. The white hat, black hat changed. We're going to have to move to gray hats, or we're going to have a lot of trouble. And the Iraq problem is just going to be a very small problem compared to the big problem if we insist on the white hat, black hat thing, and on caricatured versions of our Cold War institutions as the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you.